Okay, good afternoon. It is 4 p.m. on Monday. I realize many people don't watch this live, they watch it later on. I actually get a lot of people who watch it the next morning when they go to work. So, good morning if we're talking to you. But I'm glad to be here at 4 o'clock. We have no interview today, it's just me. So, we will talk about some Branford related topics for the most part, maybe a little bit about the state. We've got some questions about the governor race. But for the most part, it's just me, and we will talk about some Branford-related issues over the last couple of weeks that have passed the RTM, been discussed on the RTM, my views on those, and then the right approach for those things going forward. I hope you had a great weekend. Just getting a lot of tennis in. All the tennis groups with the town kind of end this week. So if you are a tennis fan and want to get out there, it's still beautiful. Come on out, play tennis. If you want to hit around, give me a call, send a text message. I'd be glad to play anytime you're looking to get out there. Want to make sure we stay active in the summer, through the winter. So good afternoon. From a topic standpoint today, our information on our social media feed said we'll talk about BACA, which is the Branford Arts and Cultural Alliance, and we'll talk about the tax collector. And the reason we'll talk about these are two issues that have been discussed significantly at the RTM level, at the town's legislature. To those who may not be familiar with Branford politics, Branford has a first selectman and a board of selectmen, and they have the town legislature, which is the representative town meeting. And that is, in years ago, it was everybody in the town came together. That's changed to a 30-member board. And so in the last week, there was some discussion on COVID funds that came from the federal government. And then last month, there was discussion on a tax collector and a change in how that's happening. So we'll start with the tax collector. We have an election coming up, but to those that are familiar with Branford, the tax collector position has been on the ballot every year, every 2 years. When the first selectman's elected, the town clerk is there, RTM members are there, and the tax collector. And you may remember we reported significantly on multiple articles on a audit that was done on the tax department before the last term. There was a tax collector in office who we'll say it nicely because she's no longer in office, but wasn't doing the job as well as it could have been done. All right, we'll just leave it at that. You can go back to Branford 7. You can look up articles, look up tax collector issues. An audit was done that found there were significant problems in the department and significant deficiencies. And I can tell you, talking to many people with the state and with the town, that report was kind of the tip of the iceberg. There were a lot of issues. I wouldn't say or characterize anything as criminal. I wouldn't characterize anything as stolen. It just felt like the job wasn't being done. And so with that, that person ran for re-election and lost. The new person's in there, Robin Parado, who has, by all accounts, cleaned up much of the misorganization. He's a kind of a finance guy, kind of knows what he's doing, and he's fixed a lot of that. But when that happened, the auditor, who is mandated by the state to come in and check this, does it every town, went to town, the first selectman and other town department heads and said, what do we do about this? Is there a way to change this? And the suggestion was that the tax collector position should not be elected, which I wholeheartedly agree with. You know, part of having an election every 2 years is you run the risk of not having someone in a vital seat that needs experience and many times needs certifications. Those certifications can take 2, 3, 4, 5 years to get. And so it doesn't make sense that every 2 years we put new names on the ballot competing for a seat. It doesn't help the town. It doesn't help the town's continuity. It actually hurts the town. So some members, I would say a couple members on each side, Democrat, Republican, ended up getting together and working on an ordinance to remove the tax collector from your ballot. So officially next year, there will be no tax collector on the ballot. It will no longer be elected, and rightfully so. But it's interesting, and I would call this one of the dumber laws to ever pass Branford's RTM. And what happened was, in the discussion, somehow it became that, okay, tax collector shouldn't be political. We shouldn't have it up for a vote. It should just be selected in position, they're as qualified, what have you. Just like every other town department for the most part, right? Parks and Rec and assessor's office and all those things are hired. The first selectman hires them, goes through human resources, they're hired, they're in position. In their infinite wisdom, and I say that sarcastically, the RTM voted to remove the tax collector from our political discussion and from a ballot, and instead have the Board of Selectmen appoint it. All right, that's not crazy. So it's not just hired. Like many town department heads are just the first selectman hires that person. They go through a vetting process. The applications come into human resources. The job is listed. We go through interviewed for multiple town departments in a hiring. So we don't want to do that. So we're going to go through the Board of Selectmen. But in its supreme idiocy, they included that the Board of Selectmen vote on a new tax collector be unanimous. That means all three members of the Board of Selectmen, which is 2 Republicans, 1 Democrat, or vice versa, 2 Democrats, 1 Republican, must be unanimous. Which essentially means the town has introduced the filibuster to the tax collector position. It means that we said, okay, we don't want this to be political, so let's take it off the ballot. Let's take it off the selection process for the 28,000 people of town, or the 18 or 19 or so thousand voters in town. Let's not have them make the decision. Let's leave it up to essentially the minority member of the Board of Selectmen, so that one person can hold up forever an appointment of a tax collector. Now, if you don't know what I mean by filibuster, it's this concept that happens in Washington all the time, where the minority party, because a supermajority is needed, more than 60% of the votes are needed for something to pass, the minority party can basically run out the clock. Just talk forever, never let it get to a vote, block the vote from ever happening, and never gets there. It's a gimmick that's played forever. The majority party always hates it. They always talk about trying to get rid of it, but it never happens. So it exists. It's probably the most unnerving thing. It's why when one party has a small majority, they can't make appointments. For example, Supreme Court appointments, because one minority party has the power to drag out this process forever, run out the clock, and never get that appointment. So now you have a Board of Selectmen that's 3 members: Jamie Cosgrove, Angela Higgins, and Ray Dunbar. Ray Dunbar is a Democrat. Jamie Cosgrove is the Republican. Angela is his running mate. So if the town goes through a process of hiring a tax collector, they go through all the interviews, they meet with Jamie Cosgrove, he decides to hire them. They come to the Board of Selectmen. The 2 Republicans say, yes, this person's fine. The person is overwhelmingly qualified. If one person, the minority member of the Board of Selectmen, doesn't like that person, they can vote no, and they can vote no forever. No provisions were written in this law that would say, okay, if you don't pass it within 45 days, it goes to someone else, or that person is automatically hired. Now, part of the reason for this is some of the people who are working on the law don't like the current tax collector. I think he's a very good guy. I think he's an honest guy, one of the more honest guys that I know, but that's beside the point. When you have elected officials using personal vendettas and putting things in laws that then pass, when you tell the public the tax collector should not be political, it shouldn't be elected, and then proceed to make it unbelievably political, so that one member of the Board of Selectmen, the minority member, the one not elected to a higher position, has the power to block that appointment, you have screwed up. And you basically have said, we are introducing the filibuster to Branford. The same crap that happens in Washington now comes here, where one person who doesn't like the personality of the tax collector or the personality of the applicant, or doesn't like whatever it is they don't like, can say, no, we don't want to do this. The bigger problem with that right now is we have in Branford a functional Republican Party, primarily because Jamie Cosgrove is the first selectman, right? Who's not very political, but things are in order. They follow, what have you. things get done the right way. He's incredibly bipartisan. The Democratic Party is not functional right now. There's some clear deficiencies within the party. More people are leaving, more complaints, not on the same page, whatever the case is. And you have groups of people who will, just for spite, hold up an appointment like that forever. Now, the vast majority of appointments made by the Board of Selectmen are majority rules. If it's 2-1, it passes. There is one board where that's not the case, and that's the Board of Ethics. But the Board of Ethics job is so small that it really doesn't matter much. And at the end of the day, it's happened in the past that those people have been held up because of that, and it became a political game until finally it had come multiple votes and discussions and more politicking to get somebody on there. So how does it make sense that we remove the tax collector from the ballot and then say, let's introduce a different type of politics to that process? It makes no sense. And so I wrote about this on my personal page probably 2 or 3 months ago, or 2 months ago when it passed. It's nonsensical. It seems to be an oversight by the RTM, but it also seems to be that there were people writing this law who early on have a personal issue with the tax collector and want that person out for whatever personal reasons they may have, no matter of qualifications. And so they have given power to either reappoint that person or hire somebody else to a minority member of the Board of Selectmen. This is pretty much politics at its worst. This is what politics is not supposed to be. So publicly, it sounds great. No, clearly tax collectors shouldn't be political. Tax collectors about qualifications. It should be, we review their resume and look at their qualifications and look at their certifications and look at their background. And then we hire them. And then they add this caveat in there for personal reasons that basically adds a new level of politics in here all over again. It's idiotic and stupid. And that's something the RTM should look to finish. Now, they may not be able to. There's often a thing where if it came up one year, they have to wait till the next year or the next term to do so. And if that's the case, whoever's in the next term should immediately take steps to change that process. But we'll talk a little bit about BACA. And last Wednesday, the representative town meeting heard a request for $75,000, not from the town, but from ARPA funds, and we'll talk about that in a second, to go to BACA. Now, a few acronyms here. BACA is the Branford Arts and Cultural Alliance. They've been around for quite some time. In full disclosure, early on, they had a movie group, and I led that. So I was part of this. Those discussions early. I went to a bunch of their meetings and overall support them as a nonprofit in town. They did come forward early on and try to present themselves or try to get basically government status. They wanted to be a town entity. I was very much against that, and the RTM wisely voted that down. Anybody can start a hobby and start a group and then say, well, to make sure we have money coming in, we want to be part of government. That's not the role of government. That's not what should happen. I was against it. The RTM voted that down at the time, and wisely so. That said, they grew a little bit more. They got more members. I think they were stagnant for a while. They were tough couldn't find volunteers, but it's kind of grown. A few years ago, maybe a year and a half, 2 years ago, a generous landowner in the center of town gave them some space rent-free for some time. And you may know this, the art gallery in the center of town, right in front of Archie Moore's, is beautiful. It's a great addition to the town center. I can make a legitimate argument that it has helped economic development. That said, they are a nonprofit, and they are, whether they're on solid footing or not, clearly COVID has had an issue there. So while they were having more and more get-togethers, more and more meetings, more artists on display, they take a percentage of the arts that's sold there. COVID shut that down to a large extent, and just like every other business. So the town received, as every town did, funds due to COVID, and they can use those monies to help businesses that have been impacted negatively by COVID. And the town received $8 million. There was some political discourse and disagreement over how those funds would be given out. I think the Democrats wanted a special committee put together, what have you. And the Republicans said, or Jamie Cosgrove said, no, bring the applications in, we'll review them, and then we'll put them forward to the RTM, and they can choose. In any event, that's the way they're going, and that kind of makes the most sense to me. So some money has been given out, and BACA has asked for $75,000. My impression initially was that was for rent, but Frank Carano, who heads up BACA, got up and said, no, it's just for whatever expenses they may have. So I'll first say my take on it, which is, yes, I would have supported giving them this money. I think a serious argument could be made. They are a significant benefit to the town, but an even more serious argument when it comes to this money is that they took a negative impact from COVID. They were an organization that was growing, maybe not swiftly, but growing, having more events, looking for ways to grow. They wanted to go in multiple different government buildings. That didn't happen. Thankfully, I don't think that's right. But COVID clearly had an impact on them. And they help many artists in town. Now, in fairness, if you've ever been in that art gallery, there's a lot of art for sale, and it's not cheap. Some is thousands of dollars, and BACA takes a percentage of that, but artists are using that to make a significant amount of money. So this is not, everybody's poor, not making money. It is more visibility for artists. Not a bad thing. And I think it is absolutely true. I've been in some events in there. They're beautiful events. They keep changing the art on the wall. So it's a really nice place to go. I think it's a benefit to the town center. Part of the discussion, and this is not BACA who asked for this, by the way. This is some of the political gamesmanship that's played as we have this discussion, is somebody always gets up and says, we should give them more. This is a great organization. This is wonderful. Well, that argument stands for pretty much every organization on the planet. We should give the firemen more and the cops more. We should give public works more and the counseling center more. We should always give people more. So that argument is political nonsense, but it doesn't really have a place in logical, intelligent discourse. The other point I want to make, though, about this idea of funding them more or for more years is just because somebody's a nonprofit doesn't mean they're under no obligation to be sustainable. A business, I start a business, you start a business, we make widgets, candles, whatever it is. We have an obligation to count our costs and figure out viability. How can we be sustainable long-term? If you have to continue to get government money for that, then you don't have sustainability. And you basically have the government paying for your hobby. Just because you file as a nonprofit doesn't mean every single business principle doesn't still apply to you. You still have a profit and loss sheet. You still have a balance sheet. You still have the same bookkeeping that has to happen. You have to have money coming in to match the money going out. And so while I support this $70,000 and certainly hope it helps them put them on a path to long-term viability, I cannot support this political belief that's thrown around of, let's just pay them every year. Give them a stipend every year. Because then where does that end? We had this discussion, I would say 10, 12 years ago with a group called the Branford Early Childhood Collaborative, the BECC. And at the time, a member who was on the BECC also happened to be second selectman. And there was a movement to give them, I think, $10,000 or $20,000 a year, which I was very much against. And trust me, I got some of the nastiest texts and phone calls you could possibly get over that. How could you be against a charity? How could you be against a nonprofit? And they got their money for a year or two until the new first selectman got in and said, oh, come on, we can't have a second selectman on the board who's on this other board who's getting money. It just made no sense. It was nonsense. It is not the job of government to help every organization in town. It is not the job of government to make sure your project gets off the ground or your project is sustainable. Even more so is a discussion we've had many times on this podcast on is all tax dollars are not the same. So where money is coming from ARPA funds, where it's coming from the federal government, sure. Help them out. The purpose is to help them get through COVID, to be sustainable through COVID. And this makes perfect sense to give them 70 or 75. I think Mary Grandy just said $70,000, $70,000 towards that goal. However, Just because somebody's a nonprofit doesn't mean tax dollars from a town should be spent on it. So I can't stop BACA or any nonprofit from filing for a grant from the state or from the federal government. But those are significantly different. Money coming from property tax, which is by all accounts regressive and a difficult tax, versus money coming from an income tax, which is tax paid by people who make money we know they can afford, are very different things. And when it comes to money coming from the property tax, we have an obligation locally to keep that property tax as low as possible, to provide all the services we can, but to keep the questionable services, the ones that are outside groups that suddenly want tax dollars, doesn't make any sense. You know, Branford does all of those things in-house already. Simply paying for a town center rent to display other people's art, those artists are making significant money on, is not something local property taxes should fund. If they want to apply for a grant and have our state reps and state senator and governor and comptroller and our U.S. congressmen fight for state or federal grants for that money for long term, so be it. More power to you. That money is set aside from people who are actually making money. It's set aside from income tax, not property tax. As we mentioned many, many times, property tax is a difficult tax. If you lose your job, you still have a tax bill. You want to retire, still have a tax bill. Reduction in income, you still have a tax bill. But income tax, lose your job, you don't pay income tax. Reduction in income, you pay less income tax. You retire, you pay less income tax, if any. The tax at the state and national level is far more based on income. We know people are making the money to pay it. So if they want to take some of that and spread it out to the arts or spread it out to local groups or send money out to grants, so be it. Private groups. The other issue with this is the issue we faced with the Blackstone and still face to this day with the Blackstone Library. The Blackstone Library, many don't often realize this, is not a town department. So their day-to-day operations are not managed by the town. When they put that addition on, it was not managed by the town. When they come forward with numbers, it is not managed by the town's building committee. So we don't have a way to know for sure the numbers are right or the numbers are being used to their greatest capacity, that we're getting value for those numbers. So by giving money based on property tax to these organizations without that sort of oversight is a wrong use of tax dollars. So I support very much BACA getting their money. The $70,000 they requested this year, if that's going to help them be viable long term. And I give a little bit of credit to a Democratic representative, Peter Henschel, who stood up and said that. He said, the goal of this money, hopefully, is that you are viable long term. What should not happen, what seems to happen every single meeting, is somebody's blowhard gets up and says, we need to give them more money. And they like to get the applause from the back of the room. Yeah, I get more money. Yeah, that's great. But that's property tax. So you go to each property member and say, you should pay for somebody else's hobby. Most people don't want to do that. It doesn't make sense. Either you're representing the interests of 28,000 people or this small group. So the money going to them now makes a lot of sense. It's not from local property tax dollars, from the federal government. It's COVID money. That makes sense. As does all COVID dollars that are going towards projects that can help recover from COVID. So I think Parks and Rec has been a huge aspect of getting more money to people outside, getting them healthier, getting them active again. That makes sense. But these are one-time expenditures. And what Jamie Cosgrove has said, and I agree wholeheartedly, is that we're not going to put in here, you can get this money for the next 10 years. What we're going to put in here is, if you want to apply, you can apply every year for more money. That's the right way to go about it. But the nonsense that we get every meeting, let's give every organization more money, is just nonsense. And it should be treated that way. We had people get up at that meeting. One Republican does this almost every meeting, gets up literally in a speech and says, I don't know anything about this organization. I didn't do any research in this, and then speaks for 10 minutes on it. The biggest blowhard you could possibly have. There was a Democrat who got up and said we should pay them 3 times as much. Same blowhard nonsense that always happens. We should be laughing those elected officials out of the room. So it's hard because you don't want to be seen against an organization. They're doing good. I like them in the center of town. I think they've helped the center of town. but they still have an obligation to be sustainable. This idea that we have that something's a nonprofit and therefore is different, it doesn't have this obligation to have profit and loss or have money coming in or have revenue, is nonsense. The only difference between a nonprofit and a for-profit is issuing stock. Most businesses, most for-profit businesses, most restaurants, most small businesses in the center of town don't show a profit at the end of the year. And if you don't believe me, ask any accountant, because the accountant will tell you, hey, there's some money left over, spend it. Most small businesses don't pay a corporate tax. They're not going to pay tax on money at the end of the year because either it goes to the owner, or they put it towards future expenses or what have you. Most small businesses are not profitable. They pay a salary to the owner, and that's it. The same as a nonprofit. And those small businesses often don't issue stock. Technically, 100% of the stock goes to that owner or 50% to partners or what have you. They're not issuing stock. They're not on the stock market. They're not doing any of those sort of things. They have no potential to be large corporations. So simply saying, wait a minute, we don't know business, we're a nonprofit, is basically saying you don't know what the hell you're talking about, because a nonprofit is a business, has the same obligations as any other business does. And so at the end of the day, this idea that an elected official can get up and say, let's give them more money because they're a nonprofit, basically shows the ignorance of that person. Mary, we are very appreciative. I'm reading Mary Grandy's comment. We are very appreciative of Jamie and the RTM for their support of BACA. Huge extra thank you to Jamie, to Ray, and Jim Finch. And yes, we have an obligation to work to be sustainable. You do. As does every nonprofit. You have an obligation to be sustainable. Now, that doesn't mean you can't use government. Doesn't mean you can't apply for every grant known to man. Go for that. Compete against all the other nonprofits looking for it. But when grants are made available based on money coming from income tax, it's far easier to accept because it's coming from money from people who have earned it. We know that person. If they're paying $20,000 in income tax, they made money that year. If you lose your job, you don't pay income tax. But your property tax, that's still coming in. No one's forgiving that. So where we get money from matters. If we're using tax dollars that are property tax dollars, we have an obligation to be, for lack of a better word, stingier. More on top of that. We have an obligation to make sure every one of those pennies are used and we get value for our dollar. It's the reason I was very, very much against the Blackstone Library project. It never made sense. They came in and said they wanted the children's room moved, they needed this extra space, but somehow that meant they had to have a walkout deck with coffee tables. Like it didn't make any sense. They could have solved that issue for a lot less money, but people, oh my God, they're a nonprofit. No, they don't have any less obligation to show a profit and loss sheet or a balance sheet like everybody else does. They have to show where they're getting their money from, and they have to look for value in how they spend it. If you want to apply for grants based on state and federal, based on income tax, knock yourself out. But when it comes to a town, we have an obligation to be far tighter with money that we get from property tax. And so I think the RTM did that, with the exception of a couple people who were just running their mouth. It overwhelmingly passed. We do have a couple conflicts of interest on the RTM where there are members who are directors of other nonprofit organizations who are very much against this, like pushing behind the scenes like crazy for BACA not to get their money. I question that person's motivation. If you were the head of the community dining room and you're lobbying heavily against another nonprofit not getting money for no reason that actually makes sense, I question if you are, in your capacity as an elected official, working for the best interests of 28,000 people or working for what you appear to be the best interest of your organization. And when you are the head of that organization, you're essentially raising money for your own salary. So we have a conflict there. And there's one member on the Democratic side who was really pushing hard against BACA getting this money, who had significant conflict of interests. And that should be worked out before that person takes a stand again on a nonprofit group getting money besides her own. That said, I'm glad the RTM passed that. Also said is that the RTM should work to change this nonsensical tax collector law that they passed last month. It makes no sense to say, let's take politics out of this process while inserting politics into the process. It's nonsensical. Tomorrow, we will have State Representative Robin Comey on. We'll interview her as she comes up on election for coming up in a few weeks. On Wednesday, we'll have Maura Kelly, who is running for the 98th District, the seat that is vacated by Sean Scanlon. And on Thursday, we are scheduled Paul Chrissy again, because last time his internet connection was poor. We couldn't get through to him. Next week, sometime we'll have Christine Cohen. There's an issue in the family with scheduling, so we're not sure what day it's going to be, but it'll be someday next week. So we'll let you know when that's going to be. So Robin Comey tomorrow, Moira on Wednesday, and then Paul Chrissy on Thursday. Look forward to having conversations with all three of them. As always, if there's questions or comments, please send them in. I'd love to read them and discuss them on air. And if there's something you need me to research or something deeper, I get some time to do that as well. Thank you, guys. Have a great night. It is now 4:30. Have a great Monday evening, and I will see you tomorrow with Robin Comey. Have a good night.